Right, welcome back to my channel, everyone. So I was really looking forward to trying out the Canon 5D as part of my kind of current trajectory at the moment, looking at kind of older cameras which were supposed to have something special about the way that they render images, the colours that they produce, the filmic look that they're supposed to be able to kind of conjure out of thin air. So one such camera on my list to try was the Canon 5D Classic or Canon 5D Mark 1 or just the Canon 5D that was released back in October 2005. So in order to kind of see whether it does indeed do all the things it's supposed to do, I thought I might as well just buy one. So I bought one. You can get them now pretty cheap. You know, I paid £170 from a well-known kind of company in the UK that does kind of used cameras, and it's in pretty good nick. And then I bought separately the later 50mm f1.8 STM lens, because obviously I wanted to kind of put a decent kind of lens on there to see what kind of results I could get with it. As well as they're supposed to be able to produce some really good images, I was also really interested in getting it because I've never had a digital SLR before. So this is in fact the first digital SLR that I've ever owned or even used. Obviously I've got film camera SLRs, but this was my first digital SLR and I was really excited to give it a whirl. However, I've owned this now for probably about 10 days and I've obviously been taking it out and trying it out quite extensively in my kind of local area and a few other kind of locations quite close to where I live here in Dorset. And while I've been doing that, I've also been comparing it with the Fuji X-E1 which I bought a few months ago now. And just because obviously this is another camera that's supposed to produce some really good kind of out camera Jpegs, and from my kind of experience with it, it certainly is a magical little camera. So I thought it was worthwhile comparing the kind of the Canon 5D with the images from the X-E1. So obviously this is a newer camera released 7 years later than the Canon 5D, so there is a little bit of difference in age. But on the flip side, the Canon 5D is a full frame, whereas this one is a crop sensor aps-c camera, so potentially a relatively fair fight. So even though it's only been about 10 days since I've been using this camera, I've kind of already made the decision that this camera is just not for me. And while I've still got the opportunity here in the UK to return this within what's called a cooling off period, if you buy something online you get 14 days to return the item from a company. It's a little bit different if you buy privately. So I'm going to take the company up on that offer and return the Canon 5D because I just haven't really got to grips with using the camera, and it was probably a mistake comparing it to the X-E1 because I just think the X-E1 is such a special camera, and the Jpegs that I've been managed to capture with it are just something else. Yeah, so obviously like my other recent purchases, I was intending to buy the Canon 5D, do kind of like a quick image kind of comparison of what I've been able to kind of capture with it, and then down the line when I've got to grips with the camera a little bit more, to produce some other videos more in depth of what I kind of like about it, what I don't like, and that I didn't think I'd be in this position after owning it for kind of 10 days and already kind of thinking about returning it. But to be honest, I really struggled to get decent results out of the camera, and more importantly just consistency as well. You know, it's like my biggest kind of issue that I've had with this camera, and I'll discuss some more issues that I've had with the camera a bit later on, but it's mainly been about trying to meter and properly expose a scene. For whatever reason, the highlights on this camera just seem to get blown out really easily. So yeah, so it's been a bit of a frustrating time with this camera, and I'm a little bit disappointed that I'm going to be having to send this back. So before discussing a little bit more as to why I came to the decision relatively quickly, I just put up some images that I've taken obviously with the Canon 5D and with the Fuji X-E1, just so you can kind of get a sense of perhaps the reasons behind this kind of decision. And like all my comparisons, there are some kind of caveats with this comparison. Obviously, the Canon 5D is a full frame camera with a 50mm autofocus lens with an aperture of f1.8. When I started off this comparison with the Fuji, I started using the 15 to 45 kit lens, which is a decent kit lens I found, and it does produce some really good results. But as I found in other comparisons, it's really difficult to kind of dial in a known kind of focal length, because the camera doesn't have any markings on its body whatsoever, and it doesn't tell you in the camera what focal length you kind of dialed in either. So to try and match the kind of the equivalent focal length of the 5D's 50mm was extremely difficult early on with this lens. So what I ended up doing was actually switching to a manual lens. So this is an Olympus OM 28mm f3.5 lens, which obviously I use on my Olympus film cameras, but it also, with the correct adapter, works well on the X-E1. But obviously the limiting factor with this is that 28mm gives me an equivalent full frame focal length of 42mm, so it's a little bit closer to the 50mm, and I thought that would probably be best to help give me a bit more kind of a consistent kind of focal length in this kind of challenge. And the other difficulty with this particular lens is, of course, it's strictly manual focus. So even though the X-E1 does allow you to kind of magnify the image and a little bit primitive kind of focus peaking, just limited to one color, it does help with manual focus, but obviously it's not going to be as good as a kind of a modern autofocus. Or I say not as good, probably just not as easier. You can, with time and practice, get really good results with manual focus lenses, but obviously with a kind of a more modern autofocus system and a decent kind of lens, I was obviously hoping at the start to get some consistency from this kind of combo rather than this combination. So yeah, so there will be differences in this reel where I've kind of have struggled a little bit to match the kind of the scenes and the compositions, but hopefully they're not as bad as they would have been if I had tried to persevere with the 15 to 45 kit lens that I have for the Fuji. And as I said before, with these cameras, the X-E1 is obviously a cropped aps-c sensor camera, and the Canon 5D is obviously a full frame 35mm camera. So I was hoping before I even started taking any images, I kind of expected the full frame camera to be better in kind of lower light situations, especially with the f1.8 50mm prime lens on here as opposed to the 3.5 aperture on this particular camera. Anyway, so here's the comparison reel. I hope you enjoy it. you've seen what I've been able to produce with the Canon 5D, I'm just going to briefly discuss what I kind of didn't really get on with this camera. Some of that is probably evident from looking at those kind of images, but I will also touch on some aspects of the Canon 5D that I've actually enjoyed using and wish kind of some of my other cameras had those kind of functions or aspects in them as well. Right, so things I didn't like. Number one, it has to be the metering system of the Canon 5D. There's a few options. You've kind of got like an ESP, center weighted, spot metering, the usual kind of ones you get with a kind of a digital camera these days. But for whatever reason, I've really struggled to kind of meter a scene correctly. And as a result, and you probably saw from those images, the highlights tended to get blown out quite easily. And even when I kind of tried multiple metering modes in the same kind of scene, I still didn't reliably get kind of a scene composed and metered the way that the kind of the X-E1 managed to meter that scene, just kind of straight out the bat without even messing around with its metering kind of modes. And when I started to struggle on initially, I realized that you could kind of set the back of the camera to the kind of the line mode, and then you can then use the rear dial when you kind of have to press the shutter to dial in some exposure compensation. And because another thing that the camera will help you with is when you show up an image on the back of the screen, you can set it to show a histogram, and the image will kind of flash where you've in fact blown out the highlights or lost kind of shadow detail. So with that information, I then did obviously try to use the exposure compensation to then dial in what I thought would meter and expose the scene in a better way, but I still struggled even after doing that. So I've got no kind of confidence in my ability to moving forward and be able to meter a scene correctly. And I talked about it with the X-E1. Like obviously I was trying really hard to obviously meter the scene correctly with the 5D, whereas the X-E1 I tended to just kind of shoot away, and it didn't really. All I had to worry about really with the X-E1 was just manually focusing the kind of the subject, and the camera kind of took over the rest and did a really admirable job. So number two, the image kind of character. I was really expecting this camera to produce some really fine looking out of the camera kind of Jpegs, or even kind of when taken into Lightroom, some really good kind of colours and images. But again, I just felt that the X-E1 did a much better job in that regard. The tonality I just find of the X-E1 is absolutely amazing. The way it kind of just renders the scene, the kind of the great Fuji colours in that original kind of X-Trans1 sensor are just magical. Yeah, so I just found that the colours had more of a pop with the X-E1, more kind of that organic filmic kind of feel that I've been harping after the last few months. And I just felt as well that the dynamic range that the X-E1 could kind of capture was just second to none compared to the Canon 5D, which, as I mentioned earlier, I had a real hard time trying to control those highlights. I did obviously manage to capture some good images the last 8 days with the Canon 5D, but as I was hampered a little bit with the X-E1 and using this vintage lens, I kind of felt that I probably could have equally produced those images with the Fuji if I had a kind of a more modern Fuji prime lens attached to the camera as well. So on to another dislike about this camera, and a lot of people see it as a positive in that this camera, it relies on an optical viewfinder. It hasn't got any kind of live view of the scene that you're kind of capturing, and I kind of felt that because I was struggling with the highlights and the metering, a live view would have been kind of really useful to help me understand the scene and try and compensate for those kind of highlights a little bit better in the camera. But you're just limited to the optical viewfinder and then what the kind of the light meter is telling you about the scene. And then obviously when you take a picture, you can then look on the back on the histogram and see where you've kind of blown out or lost kind of shadow detail. And at that point you can then try the whole exposure compensation dial and refocus to have another go. But I tried that on countless number of times and it didn't really make much of a difference for me. Right, so I'll talk about the viewfinder being a positive in a minute, but I also found it a little bit of a negative because I wear glasses. It's very hard, even though the viewfinder is so big, to sometimes see the kind of the information that it displays at the very bottom, in terms of the exposure, whether you've dialed in any kind of compensation and the shutter and the kind of the apertures as well, depending on the mode you've kind of dialed into the camera. So definitely it was great to use to compose with, and even better when I take off my glasses because it can actually fit right up to it. But it could have been better if there was a diopter attached to the viewfinder as well. And I also did have problems when it was quite bright, whereas even you can see when I put my glasses up to it, there's kind of a gap, so the light kind of came through and it kind of made it much harder to kind of read the information. So a lot of the times I was having to try and cup my hand over the gap between the camera and my head to obviously try and shield the light from entering that kind of viewfinder. So yeah, I did, even though it's much bigger than the one on the X-E1, the X-E1 for me is still more usable because it's got that important kind of diopter, so I can literally take off my glasses and I can literally plug my eye straight up to the viewfinder, and that kind of seals it from extra light. So even though it's titchy, I do prefer the X-E1's viewfinder in operation. Right, number 5, you might have noticed that this is a pretty big camera, and for someone that's used to these kind of cameras, it is a bit big and it is a bit chunky, and the body alone weighs over 800 grams. And this feels heavy at the moment, but it's got kind of an adapter and an old metal vintage lens on the front, so it's going to feel a little bit heavier than, say, with a prime kind of plastic lens on the front. But as you can see, probably not very well, they are quite a little bit different in size. But the size is also probably a good point as well, and I'll come on to those in a little bit, because I've had to recently buy a thumb grip for the X-E1 because I do find it's a bit more natural to hold the camera with a bit more of a grip up in that kind of area, and almost like I had with the X100. Right, so on to a final kind of dislike for this video, and that has to be the colour out of camera JPEGs. Like I said, I was kind of really hoping that these out of camera JPEGs would have been really kind of something special, but in my opinion, and compared to the kind of the X-E1, I don't think they're all that great. And I actually found that Lightroom does a much better job when it kind of renders the raw file. When I exported that just straight raw processed image from Lightroom, it generally produced a much better kind of look than the original out of camera kind of neutral JPEG. It could be seen as a positive in that the Lightroom does a really good job with the raw file, whereas the opposite is true for the X-E1, in that the out of camera JPEGs in this camera are amazing, but the actual raw files processed in Lightroom just are horrible in comparison. And what I'm probably going to be tempted to do with the X-E1 is buy a license for the Iridiant X transformer plugin that you can get, because that seems to do for me the best job for these X-E1 X-Trans raw files. Now on to what I actually did like while I've been using the Canon 5D. As I mentioned earlier, the viewfinder was a negative in some regards, but generally it's probably the biggest viewfinder that I've ever used. It's probably bigger than the one on my Olympus EM1, and that's saying something, so I thought that one was pretty big and pretty easy to use, but this one is pretty good. It's also, despite its size, I know I picked this up, is a negative. It does also feel really good in the hand, and it almost makes me feel like a grown-up photographer using like a full frame DSLR. and it just feels kind of solid, you know, and there's not many kind of settings in this camera, being quite old. You can't even set in auto ISO, but that almost helps a little bit in kind of keeping it all simple, with everything that you need kind of at a fingertip away, and you don't really need to dive into any menus like you do on some of the more modern cameras, and with the X-E1 to some regards, although with the physical controls on the X-E1 it does make that easier. Yeah, so another thing about the handling and the overall design really of the Canon 5D is that I really like the kind of the top display on this camera. It's got like a light as well that you can light up if you want, and it literally allows you to see at a glance all the settings that you've kind of dialed into this camera, and then you can also kind of then change them on the fly with just a couple clicks of the buttons. So I really found that quite good, whereas like I said, with more modern cameras you've got to delve into the kind of the menu system to get some of that information. Like I said earlier, in one of its downfalls, it hasn't got any live view. It's just got this viewfinder, which is an optical viewfinder, which I really do like, and I do miss that from the Fuji X100, the ability to kind of be able to see in all situations and in all light, and then just kind of snap away. But I do think as well it would benefit, and it probably does have it in the later iterations, a live view aspect as well, so you can kind of see the scene to help you kind of meter and expose for the composition correctly. So I did find in some of the images, and you probably see it a little bit in those comparisons, is that I did find with this particular lens, the Canon did a good job at separating the subject from the scene, although it wasn't strictly a fair fight in this regard. Like I said, I'm only using a vintage lens on the X-E1. I'm sure if I put on a native kind of prime lens like a 35mm f1.4, it would probably do just as good job as the Canon in terms of separating the subject from a scene. But yeah, it did do a pretty good job in some instances. Right, so even though I wasn't impressed with the colour JPEGs that this camera produced, it was a different thing entirely with the monochrome images that I was able to get from this camera. And there's actually quite a lot of settings you can actually change. Yeah, so I dialed in a monochrome profile with kind of +3 sharpness, -2 I think contrast, and then applied a red filter. And I was able to get, I'll put some images again now, I was able to get some really good monochrome images when the camera actually metered the scene correctly. And in some instances they were much better than the ones that I could achieve with my kind of tweaked monochrome profile in the X-E1. But again, a bit like before, I do feel that if I tried a bit harder with this camera in terms of selecting a different metering mode and using a better lens, I could have kind of achieved similar results that I managed to achieve with the Canon 5D. But saying that, the images were very good in black and white. The next two lights are kind of combined. I knew before I got this that the battery life of these cameras are so much better than the mirrorless options. It just goes on and on. It's like a Duracell battery. And like I said, even though it's a third party, it has really kind of lived up to expectations in that regard. And another thing that kind of enables you to do is I feel kind of confident when I'm using the camera to just kind of leave it on like it's been on now while I've been kind of talking. And I know as soon as I hit a button or depress the shutter, it will bounce back into life virtually instantaneous and allow me to kind of carry on shooting in a moment, you know, whereas with the kind of the mirrorless cameras, I tend to kind of turn it on, wait a little bit, take the shot, and then turn it off to preserve battery life. Whereas, like I said, the Canon 5D, look, it's kind of gone into a sleep mode. You just kind of have to press the shutter button and it's ready to take the shot, you know. Whereas obviously with the mirrorless cameras, if you turn them off, you've got to wait for them to kind of boot up. But that's probably just me. You probably can, if you've got more than one battery, just leave the camera on, let it go into kind of sleep mode, and then to press the shutter or press a button when you want it to wake up. But I just found it to be very kind of instinctive when I was using it that way with the Canon 5D. Yeah, so that was a quick kind of look at what I've kind of liked and what I've kind of disliked of this camera over my limited time that I've had and been using this kind of camera. But I really kind of was expecting, after everything I read and everything I kind of saw on YouTube, where other people have kind of done similar kind of retrospective reviews of this camera in 2020, 2021, etc., etc. But from that, I was kind of, I was just expecting it to be better when in fact my lowly X-E1 did a much better job in most of those kind of scenarios that you just seen. The last couple of days, I did feel that I was kind of getting the hang of the Canon 5D. And when I took it down to Weymouth and the light wasn't quite as harsh and the histogram wasn't showing that I was blurring the highlights out as much, I thought to myself at that point that I must have kind of cracked it, and it can now start delivering really good results. But then I came home, obviously compared the images against the X-E1 and realised that the X-E1 just did a much better job pretty much on everything that I took without really having to try that hard. That for me is key. It's great to have a tool that you can just use to snap away and capture kind of moments really just on thinking about them and knowing that you're going to get a good image out of it. Whereas even though it's nice sometimes to have a camera that slows you down, if you're not going to get the results that you expect out of it, then what's the point in owning it really? So don't get me wrong, I'll put some images up now, but I have managed to take some really nice images with this camera, obviously, because you are kind of capturing those moments when you see them. And sometimes I manage to capture a moment with the 5D that I miss with the X-E1 and vice versa really. But generally I didn't really get the consistency that I kind of expect or need with a camera these days. I also hoped as well when I was in Weymouth yesterday that when the light started to drop, that the advantage of having a full frame sensor would have started to show through. But again, I just found that even when I was in kind of near dark situations, the Fuji managed again to do a much better job at kind of retaining detail from the kind of the shadows, but correctly kind of exposing and metering for the scene. Like I'll put this image up again now, this comparison, which was pretty much overlooking some lit buildings over a harbour. And the X-E1 image, considering I had to focus that lens in the dark, just did such an amazing job. And like all the comparisons that you just seen, they are pretty much straight out of the camera images. I haven't done anything with them, and the X-E1 just continues to just blow me away really in the quality of the images that it can produce. And as I said before as well, I was trying, obviously this is the new camera, the new kid on the block. I was trying really hard with this one to meter the scenes correctly, whereas with the Fuji I just focused in on the subject and snapped away and didn't really worry about any of the other kind of settings other beyond kind of obviously the aperture. But obviously when the light started to fall, it was pretty much stuck on aperture 3.5 because that was the lowest that this lens could kind of utilize. So, and then the X-E1 just came out on top again. So it's again another disappointment for the Canon 5D for me. So there we go. This is probably going to be my one and done video with the Canon 5D. I had hoped that this was going to be the DSLR that would have tempted me over to the dark side of full frame kind of cameras, but if anything, after this little experiment and comparison, I've been swayed more to the aps-c side of digital cameras as I continue to be amazed at the performance of this little Fuji X-E1. So there we go. In conclusion, if you're thinking about getting the Canon 5D, you might want to first consider giving the X-E1 a go, or the X Pro 1 if you can afford it. Although the reason I didn't go for the X Pro 1, as I've talked about in other videos, is that you don't get basically a diopter as default on the viewfinder, and then obviously the X-E1 is a kind of a lot smaller and lighter than the X Pro 1, and also the bodies Like this is half the price at least of an X Pro 1 here in the UK. So this is why I went for the X-E1, and so far it has not disappointed. So yeah, so I hope this video hasn't come across as more of a chuck up for the X-E1, and I hope it did have some useful information for those that are kind of thinking about getting the Canon 5D. For me, it's probably my biggest disappointment so far since starting this journey at looking at older kind of cameras in the way that they kind of render images, because I probably bang on about this long enough, but just because a camera is newer doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be better. And the problem I see time and time again is that images on newer modern cameras are just looking far too kind of clean and digital, and are missing that kind of character that these older cameras are capable of, really. So it's worth kind of looking further afield, seeing what is available, and basically what is important is what you actually want to do with the camera. You know, I'm still debating whether this is going to replace my Olympus system, or whether I'm just going to stick on a small prime lens and let it kind of complement my existing system. So it all depends what you want to do with the camera as well. Is a big part of kind of photography, and in deciding what kind of gear is best for you. So I hope you really enjoyed that little run through. If you've got any questions, please feel to put them in the box below, and I do try to answer all questions that people ask of me, and I'll see you next time. So thanks for watching. Bye for now.